Noswaith dda a chroeso cynnes iawn I chi yn fyw yn rhithiol yma I fferm Hendre Ifan Goch yn Bridgend. Good evening and a warm welcome to you here to Hendre Ifan Goch Farm in Bridgend. Fe enw I yw Lynwen Matthias a dwi'n swyddog technegol Ci Coch ar gyfer De-ddwyrain Cymru I gyswllt ffermio, a fi bydd yn arwain y webinar yma heno. My name is Lynwen Matthias and I'm a Red Meat Technical Officer for South East Wales for Farming Connect, and I will be running this webinar tonight. It might not be as good as an actual on-farm visit, but we will try our very best to give you an insight into the work that's been going on here at Hendre Ifan Goch Farm. We are glad that you have been able to join us tonight, and we are hoping for this evening to be as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, please do ask them. If you are watching on Zoom, please ask your questions through the Q&A box. And if you are watching on Facebook Live, please comment your questions. Bydd gweddill y noson trwy gyfrwng y Saesneg, ond mae croeso I chi ofyn cwestiynau trwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg neu'r Saesneg. Os chi'n gwylio ar Facebook Live, allwch chi roi'r cwestiynau yn y comment box. Neu os chi'n gwylio ar Zoom, please rhowch y cwestiynau yn y Q&A box. We are very lucky to have a range of expert speakers joining us virtually this evening, most of which have been working with us on a project that we will be concentrating and discussing this evening. So, joining us this evening will be Dr. Liz Jennifer, an independent beef and sheep consultant who has been leading on the project work here. A familiar name and face to most of you this evening, I'm sure. Then we will hear from Philippa Page, a sheep vet consultant from Flock Health Limited, who is also involved with the project work here at Hendre Ifan Goch Farm. James Rogeri from Hubby Key Cymru Meat Promotion Wales will give us a market and project update. And then we will hear from Hannah Wright, who is a local development officer with Farming Connect for this area. And she will close the meeting by giving us a quick overview of the services that are available through Farming Connect. And the star of the show, sat next to me here, is Rhys Edwards, who farms here at Hendre Ifan Goch Farm, with his parents, Russell and Eira. Thank you very much for having us this evening, Rhys. I'm sure some people watching are familiar with you and your farm, but for the ones that are not familiar, could you give us a brief introduction to the farm, please?
Yeah, we're on Hendre Ifan Goch Farm in Blackmill, Bridgend. The farm was purchased by my grandparents in 1975, and my father has since taken over the farm with my mother. I expect I'll be coming into the business in a few years to come. The farm is now 220 acres of grazing. We range from 500 to 1300 feet above sea level. We're very wet here, so we have 2 meters plus a year of rainfall, and hence why we've got the sheds. And that's about it at the farm, really.
Yeah, and with the livestock, what sheep numbers do you run on the farm? Yeah,
so we're sheep only now. We've had every animal possible over the years, but we've stuck with the sheep now. So we're running lambing 530 ewes this year, and we're running 180 ewe lambs dry through this winter. So the ewes are made up of about 150 coloured Welsh mules that we put a top 1% high performance Texel sire on, and we keep the ewe lamb replacements back from them then, and the rest of the Welsh mule cross Texels. And we've used all sires over the years, but with the Ram Compared project, but we're now going for a top 1% Texel tups to breed lambs for the market and ewe lambs from here on.
Oh, good. So you're lambing inside then, and then...
Yeah, lambing everything indoors. We house from start to December, really. We feed a TMR diet through the winter. We make our own pit silage. We top the silage up. We analyse our silage and work out the megajoules they get in just off the silage, and then we top it up with concentrate or maize or whatever we need to make sure the ewes pre-lambing are getting sufficient diet. We installed a slatted shed as well to house the majority of the ewes, well, all the ewes really. It's going to house 540 up there. We'll come on to a bit about that later on. But yeah, we're just trying to cut every corner we can without cutting production, and trying to be as efficient as we can.
Oh, good. And I know on the farm as well, you've done some diversification. I don't know if you want to explain a bit about that.
Yeah, so Mum and Dad in the year 2000 opened Lakeside Farm Park and Fishing, trout fishing. So they run that for 10, 11 years and we leased it out now as an event and wedding venue. So it's Lakeside venue, and they're doing very successful, and so we leased that out. In 2013 we opened a 60 pitch caravan and camping site, full electric and the toilet block and facilities, and we're currently running that ourselves, and it's working very well. Nice bit of income through the summer. We've also done a bit of renewables. We installed a 6 kilowatt hydro generator, and it produces about 29,000 kilowatt hours annually, and it harnesses our massive rainfall that we have, which you know, we're trying to make use of anything that we got on farm natural. And with the electric then we've installed a ground source heat pump in the farmhouse, which we get an RHI payment for, and it uses the electric that the hydro produces. So it's sort of all working you know, hand in hand. We run every business individually, and if there's anything, no other business props the other one up. They all got to stand on their own 2 feet, and they are all at the minute. The only one we did sort of have to sort of help along a little bit was the campsite, obviously for obvious reasons with COVID year before last. But yeah, but they made up for it last year. We had the best year ever after COVID with the restrictions on travelling abroad. So yeah, so we're trying to do what we can. Yeah, so all runs well together then? Yeah. Oh, that sounds good. And you've been involved in various schemes over the years, such as the Prosperous Pasture, Grass Check GB, Ram Compare, and you've been an active member of the local YFC in your time as well. Do you feel these have helped you to gain skills which have been beneficial to your business here? Yeah, definitely. As young farmers has helped me become confident in speaking and you know, being cheeky and asking questions in certain environments. The Ram Compare project, we've learned a hell of a lot from over the years. We've proved that we can make more profit by using high performance EBV rams, and since we just dropped out the project now because we think we've learnt all we can from it. Nothing will come to our farm now unless it's in the top 1% of its breed. We've just got our benchmark now that any little fine tunings that we can do, we want to do, which will help us labour and everything else wise down the line, and days to slaughter and everything else. So we've learnt from that. We've also been in Grass Check GB, and we still are. We're measuring grass every week and analysing grass analysis every fortnightly. We've learned a hell of a lot from that. We're seeing what energy, dry matter and everything the lambs and ewes are grazing right through the season, and any little issues with weight gain or anything we're having, we can sort of look into the pastures and see if there's any areas that we're lacking behind and everything else. So yeah, and then obviously within Farming Connect Demo Farm now, and so all these projects are sort of working hand in hand and helping each other and working closely with vets to try and fine tune any problems. As I say, we're not doing bad anyway, if that makes sense, but any little fine tunings we can do, we want to try and improve on. Oh, sounds good. And so we've had a good insight into your business now with our little chat and see how the farm is at the moment. But do you have any plans for the near future, or do you know some objectives you have? Make as much money as possible without getting caught out with any mad price increases, but without having any less performance of our animals. we want to be as low input but high output, hence why we got lowland type ewes on a hill farm. But we're rearing a lot of lambs, and we're doing it as efficient as possible, making our own pit silage and everything else. So it's just watch the markets really. It depends what happens next. It's like the fertiliser. You don't put fertiliser out, you don't have grass. So you don't buy fertiliser, you don't have grass, you don't sell fat lamb. So it's all got to be sensibly thought out. So as for the question, it's take it as it comes really.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And that moves us on nicely to introduce you as the demo farm for Farming Connect. And from the initial meetings, you were keen to develop the flock health, flock performance and the carbon footprint of the farm. And with this in mind, the project's running here at Hendre, Ifan, Goch is understanding the farm's carbon footprint and how to improve it, and also maximising lamb performance throughout the year. As the farm had already invested in slatted flooring for their sheep shed, a project was done to look at the alternative bedding options, which has now been completed. What were you hoping to get out of these projects?
As a health project with the sheep, lameness has been a little issue in the background, a consistent issue that we were hoping to look into a bit further, nutrition and bedding options or whatever. We have made some little bit of progress. It seems to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes, but yeah, I think we're on the right path. It's just it's frustrating that there's not, there's a lot of unknowns still with the lameness. And then the other project, the carbon footprint, we wanted to see a baseline for the farm, what our carbon footprint was. Depends which calculator you do. Some don't take half the sequestration into account that others do, but the one that did take it all into account, the farm carbon toolkit, come back with sequestering about 200 tonnes of carbon on, including any bad that we do with the emissions off the ewes and anything else. It's a pity that not many consultants recognise it and will stand behind it, and industries will believe in our findings. I think it's too good to be true, but what we've wanted to prove on our farm, I don't think we can physically do any more to be any carbon friendly than what we're already doing. So if we're not carbon neutral and carbon friendly now, we're never going to be it unless we sell all the sheep, and then we wouldn't be a farming business. So it's got to work hand in hand, and I think we're doing as good as we can, and I don't know, see what, but yeah, the results we've had so far are pretty good, as Liz probably will touch on later.
Oh, great. Thank you, Rhys. Yeah. That leads us on nicely to our first speaker for this evening, who is Dr. Liz Jennifer, an independent beef and sheep consultant who has been leading on the project work here at Hendre, Ifan, Goch farm, and will discuss what has been happening here with the project work for the slatted floor and the farm's carbon footprint project. So over to you, Liz. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm hoping that is all okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk really through 2 projects. So this is the plan, the summary of the bedding project really, and so and most importantly, what's been done as a result of that. So we did that this time last year, and obviously in terms of what the plan is for this year, what's being done this year, as the sheep have been inside since around Christmas time. And as Rhys mentioned, also talking through the carbon footprinting results. So highlight the hotspots and the activity that's planned, and other sort of top tips for how we can use them. And I'll also highlight the key areas that we're looking at for this year. So the first up is the bedding trial, and some of these slides, we did do a webinar on it, so you may have seen some of these before, but it was just useful to go through it again. So the principle of what we were trying to achieve was to test 5 bedding. So as mentioned, Rhys and Russell invested their time and energy and money really into a slatted shed, and so we were then comparing that against wheat straw, sawdust, barley straw and EnviroBed, which is a type of paper waste. So you can see the prices that were being used, that were for the products last year. So and I'll mention in terms of the prices have come down this year. And as mentioned, it was looking at lameness because it was thought that the bedding choice was affecting the lameness level. So we also looked at lameness. We looked at the amount of bedding that was being used, and I'll show you that in a second. The labour, so that in terms of topping up or having to how many times you have to remove it to then replace it, the cleanliness of the animals, and then the overall cost of what we were doing. So we can see sort of the picture in the middle is the sheep on the EnviroBed. You've got the slats and then the sawdust in the top. So in terms of, we mentioned lameness. To be fair, there was only 8 lame ewes, so it wasn't like it was there was a huge problem. But what was interesting is quite a lot of them were found on the wheat straw area. So, and sawdust had one, and the EnviroBed had a couple. So that has also, as we go through it in terms of thinking about how the information's been used, that has also led in terms of some of the decisions that now are being made on farm. Which one used the most bedding? So in terms of housing those sheep on these systems for 6 weeks. So wheat straw was just around about 300 grams across all of those groups. Sawdust was a bit higher, just nearly 900 kilos, sorry. Barley straw, similar to wheat straw. EnviroBed was higher. Obviously slats was 0. So obviously we saw this range in terms of how much was being used, which then had obviously an implication for the cost associated with those different systems. So hopefully you can see from this one, so the costs, we split them up into bedding cost, so that was the physical amount per kilo or per tonne delivered onto farm, and the amount used, which we've just seen. We also looked at labour, so this was an indication of how much time was being used replenishing the bedding. So you can see that the EnviroBed, the cost of it was quite high, so the actual tonnage price was quite high, and quite a bit of it was used, and also it was relatively high in labour. You can see wheat straw and barley straw relatively similar, sawdust slightly cheaper for bedding cost, and slightly higher in terms of labour. The little crosses you can see is the pence per day per ewe. So this is what's read off the graph on the right hand side. So wheat straw sitting around about 12p, sawdust similar, barley straw similar again. EnviroBed jumps up to just over 30p, and slats are working out to be about 3p, and I'll go through in a second. And that just sort of so that's sort of looking at all the range of costs that were collected as part of the trial. So this is how we costed out the slats. So the cost of the actual putting the slats in was about 18,000, and that excluded the labour. So Reese also did most of the work themselves, and also they used their own machinery. So we did it in 2 ways, really looking at the sort of a residual value, so like depreciated over 10 years, and that's where that 3p per day per ewe cost came from. If we slightly tweaked how we depreciated it, then it dropped in terms of it lasted longer, but it was worth less at the end. So that's sort of the numbers that we're working towards. The other thing we've got to remember is that those sheds have been used to put finishing lambs, so orphan lambs or other lambs have been moved onto those slats during the summer. So it's also trying to get value during that cost is just for that relatively short amount of the year that they're on it, that we can reduce the cost because they're being used by other classes of sheep throughout the year. The question about cleanliness, really. So these were the weeks, and again, each week, Reese and Russell used the sort of meat hygiene sort of scoring system to have an indication of how clean these sheep were. So you can see again the wheat straw and the barley straw are in this zone here, so they're sort of on top of one another, so they you can't see wheat straw, but it's sitting behind this green line here. The EnviroBed tended to be dirtier, so 5 is cleaner, and so 5 is very clean. So the lower the score, the more dirty the animals. So you can see the slats were generally keeping those animals around about 4. The barley straw, wheat straw was by the end sort of about 3.5 on average. the sawdust was slightly worse in terms of cleanliness. What was important, I should have mentioned earlier, is that the EnviroBed actually was stopped at week 5 just because it wasn't doing a job really. So that's why that line just stops there. So in terms of what we're looking for is that we showed that slats were cheaper, they tended to keep the animals cleaner. But obviously, because of the welfare concerns and various assurances, we can't lamb sheep on slats. So then it's decisions in terms of, as we transition them into lambing and then obviously into lactation before they're turned out for some of these groups, what bedding can we use? But certainly up until that point of lambing, slats are offering a very good alternative. So because of this, we found quite a strong relationship between lameness and wheat straw. It could have been a quirk of that year, but again, the decision has been not to use wheat straw at all. They're using sawdust, and that's dropped to £7 a tonne, and that's being used for the ewe lambs as soon as they came into the shed, and also for pre-lambing for the ewes. So the ewes are being moved onto those pens with sawdust before they lamb. Barley straw is being used, and again the price has dropped for barley straw compared to the prices that were being paid last year, and that's being used in the individual pens and around the time of lambing. And then once those sheep have moved out of those individual pens, and this is for the early group, so the early group are being housed, not being turned out. The later group will hopefully quite quickly be turned out post lambing. They're using sawdust as the base, so cheap, and it means cheaper than straw, and then straw over the top for the ewes and lambs at this stage. So it's quite a nice sort of system of a bit of a hybrid between the sawdust is offering the cost effectiveness, but then the barley straw is helping from a cleanliness perspective when those sheep with lambs can no longer be on the slats. And there is sorry, I've just pressed the wrong button. There we go. And the ambition or the plan might be to find some other sheets where some slats can be retrofitted, but at the moment it's a bit of a question mark, but not in terms of slats, but just obviously in terms of the investment in that shed. So if we just quickly look at the carbon footprint, so as Reece mentioned, a couple were used, but I'm presenting the results from the Carbon Farm Toolkit. Farm Carbon Toolkit. I never set in the right order. So this is the summary. So this the blue bar here is the emissions from the farm. So that's anything to do with animals, fuel, fertilizer, feed. Generally, they're the big ones. The big darker green bar is the offset. So that's carbon that's being locked up or already has been locked up in terms of organic matter and the build-up over time. It's also taken into consideration hedges. It takes into consideration scrap as well, so things that sort of have embedded carbon into them in this calculator. So we can generally see the emissions from this farm, the blue line, is a slightly smaller bar than this big green bar, here. So what that means is that the carbon balance is negative, which means they are sequestering, so storing or securing more carbon into the soils or the resources on the farm than they're emitting through animal production. So this idea of being carbon or better than carbon zero, basically. So that's what's interesting about this farm, is that, as Reece said, there are, through this calculator, they are showing to be better than carbon zero. And the reason why, so you can hopefully see from that, is that the big, unsurprisingly, and generally on most farms when we look at carbon footprints, the emissions coming from the livestock is contributing about 50% of total emissions. So that looks like it's actually a higher proportion of this farm, which means there's less coming from fuel and fert. But livestock tends to be the most source of emissions, and that's generally methane from rumination that's being classed as that, that's causing that emission factor to be so high. Then we look at what's actually helping this farm become better than carbon zero is actually the soil organic matter. So because soil organic matter tests have been done on this farm and the actual data is available, that can be included in, and some of the fields on the farm are higher than 8, 10, 12% in terms of organic matter. It's quite an interesting system based from a pH perspective, which I'll talk about in a second, but it's massive opportunity to store and already is storing a huge amount of carbon. Sometimes the challenge is how much more can it store, but certainly the key with this is not to do significant amount of soil disturbance and basically just leave that carbon alone, and that's what's having this big impact on this farm. It's from a carbon perspective. If we look at the emissions, so as I said, it's about 50% coming from livestock, 13% coming from fertiliser, which might be reducing this year as it will be on quite a few farms. A bit from lamb finishing, so that's likely to be creep or other things, or those animals being on the farm as well. There's a bit of a reduction in organic matter, which is sort of this is the risk with organic matter. We have benefit, so we're sinking stuff into the ground, but if we do some cultivations or reseeding, there is a risk of releasing some carbon from organic matter too, and that is counted as an emission on farm. And then 4% from feed, which is what's going into the ewes. So that's a relatively common sort of balance. So vast majority coming from the adult breeding stock, and then sort of anywhere between 10, 15, 20% coming from these other sections. Again, low in terms of the big ones really to looking out for is feed, fertiliser and fuel. So you can see two of them are on the screen in terms of hotspots. So what are we then looking at? So as Reece sort of mentioned, it's nice to have that number, but what can we do to make it better? And it is already, it is already very good, but it's very reliant on that organic matter. So we've got some tweaks to be made in terms of the livestock perspective, and so we've got some ewe efficiency things to look at. So that's looking at average ewe weight at topping and looking at actually growth rate performances compared to that. So we're looking at we're aiming for greater than 65% as a rearing weight for lambs, which at 1.65%. At weaning is coming out about 20. We want lambs to be on average 26 kilos at weaning. At the moment, they're not quite there all the way through the flock. We've also got some queries around post-weaning growth rates. So we're looking at marketing patterns. So certainly we see generally most years a slight drop in growth rates midsummer, sort of mid to late summer. So we are looking more intensely at the marketing patterns. Again, anything in bold is items that we're looking at this year. Reece mentioned you been previously involved in ram compare, not now, but still single cell mating with high genetics, and there is this focus on selecting the right type of rams for their system, and so the idea of selecting texels, but also because those texels are being used to breed replacements, also looking at maternal traits too. Dealing with trace elements, and Philippa will talk a bit more through that. And again, as Reece highlighted, lameness is still rumbling on. So just thinking also about lameness, but trace elements being the main focus for this year. And we also highlighted that could mycoplasma be contributing towards that poorer growth rates. And certainly there was a little bit of a spike in pneumonia this year, and sometimes on some of the abattoir returns there's during queries regarding lung condition. So again, we're just in any of those, if any lambs die, then again a post-mortem will be done on proportion to sort of understand what's going on from a lung perspective, and could that be contributing to the poor growth rates, because we've sort of appeared to have eliminated most of the other common factors. And then in terms of fert use, and again the price is changing people's practices towards fertiliser, but as Reece said, it's also important part of driving up silage quality and yield on certain systems. We have been trying to find an alternative source, so chicken manure has been used before. Again, it's not always readily available. There's quite a lot of AIM sort of markets for it really. We're trying to encourage clover to try and reduce that level of nitrogen fertiliser. Again, quite challenging to do in one season, but working towards that. The high organic matters are challenging from a pH perspective. They buffer any lime that's applied quite significantly, so it's quite difficult to get those pHs anywhere above sort of 5.6. So that can be a challenge for other things, so clover in particular. We're also investigating using some foliar fertiliser to replace some of the prilled nitrogen, and that's a project for this year. The ambition is to reduce some fuel use, so that's where the slats could come in, and we're also looking at there's a potential of increasing the amount of hedges or trees on farm. So the main point of or top tips for carbon footprinting is use the same tool. That's how you do the benchmark. So if you use multiple tools, you will get different answers. Check what's in and out, so they all have slightly different boundaries in terms of what is included in the tools. So that's why it's important to use the same one, particularly if you're doing it with a group. Make sure it's the same tool being used. What are the units? Is it a per hectare tool or is it a per kilo live weight? Again, depends on what you want to sort of investigate from that. And also carbon is one thing, but we also need to think about biodiversity and other things. And then just final slide in terms of these are the two projects or two areas that we're really looking on, which is options around fertiliser reduction and also looking at these post-weaning lamb growth rates. And it could be that we've talked about using some new nutritionally enhanced or improved straw as a way to buffer some of the grass quality issues that we've also identified. That.
Thank you, Liz. And I hope that gives you all watching an insight into the work that's been going on here at Hendre Ifan Goch. I'd like to encourage you to ask as many questions as you have, so please remember to comment them if you're watching on Facebook Live or to put them in the Q&A box if you're watching over Zoom. We've had one question through. So, would Rhys do anything differently if they were to put slatted flooring in again?
Quick answer to that one would be to have put more in when we did, just because the price and everything have gone up. The issue, I suppose, that when we put our slats in was we were working with an existing old barn, which we've refurbished the barn pretty much around the slats. So we had an excavator inside the shed digging out the tanks, and we had to work with the steels and the uprights as we've done. We've got maybe the only thing I'd have done different is put the feed barriers on the edge of the slats, just because we've got a foot before the actual slats then. But no, so far I don't think we'd change a lot. It's working very well. I think we've picked the right slats. You know, they're very sturdy, solid. MIK ones are from Germany. But no, it's working very well. The sheep are very content on them, and yeah, it's working very well.
Yeah, so far you're pleased with them?
Yeah, very well.
That's good. So we'll leave the questions there for now. We'll move on to our next speaker for this evening, who is Philippa Page from Flock Health Limited. As previously mentioned, Philippa is a sheep vet consultant for Flock Health Limited and has started working on the Maximising Lamb Performance project here at Hendre Ifan Goch, which Philippa will discuss more with us now. So over to you, Philippa. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you very much. Evening all, I hope you're all okay. Yeah, so I've got a short 10 minutes here. I just want to give an overview really of what we're doing this year and moving forward this performance period to as a means of part of this project. I came sort of on board. I've worked with Rhys throughout various projects, the Ram Compare and other Farming Connect projects, and I became involved with Liz Jennifer into this year and focusing, I suppose, on post-weaning and pre-weaning lamb growth rates, and also with a focus tonight I'm going to talk about is the trace element audit that we've sort of started on. So rarely lamb growth rate issues are just one thing, or are caused by just one thing, as we all know, and it's really important to consider this, as Rhys is doing. Rhys and Russell and also Liz and everybody else that's working together at Hendre Ifan Goch are really looking at all these different areas, and they are certainly to consider, and they all play a part in lamb growth. And they need to be considered as such. So it's such a big task, but the attention to detail is crucial, and rightly so. Rhys have talked about the carbon footprint and efficiency, and all of these different areas will have some impact on that. And actually, they all kind of work together or against each other as well. So it's important to consider them. We've talked through where growth rate seems to be an issue on the farm, and so as a result, we wanted to establish really the how important trace elements were playing, how much of an important part they were actually playing in these growth rate issues, and what the current status is on the farm. And some of you watching probably have been involved in trace element mineral audits that we have done through Farming Connect, and so we wanted to do something very similar with Reese, and that involves looking at the whole supply of trace elements across the farm. So I'll come on to that a little bit later and discuss how we went through that. Firstly, I think this is quite important for everybody, as well as certainly here, but it's looking at what our targets are. And I don't think always do that. And the targets for growth rates vary also depending upon what class of stock we've got. So we might actually have different targets for ewe lamb replacements. We'll have different targets for lambs depending on when we want to finish them and what our market is. And so for everybody, and certainly here, it's looking at what we're sort of aiming for, which is important, and then we know we can establish and we can measure things. And this is just produced from Eblex many years ago, but it's very useful in looking at target growth rates depending on finishing age and your actual carcass weight. So those resources are there for you to look at, and I would certainly do that, and we will be doing that with Reese as well, to look at where we can look at certain areas. And just to remind us all what is really important and what affects lamb growth. And yes, the ewe, crucial, as we know. Parasites, certainly crucial, as we know. And grass also is nutrition, playing a massive part. And within that nutrition, we've got the quality, we've got the quantity, and then we've also got the trace element supply. So all of those factors are really important, and we can't consider them individually. We've got to look at the whole picture. And we've got to monitor as well, and we've got to look at when we actually where our targets are and strategic points to measure rates to see at where we might need to focus our efforts. And that's what Reese has been very good at, and that's what hopefully we'll continue to do this year moving through. So just touching on trace elements then, and that's what we've started this year. We could spend days talking about trace elements, and it certainly can't be done in the next 5 minutes. But we know, you know, that they are essential for growth and fertility, and all things health related, immune function and so on, for ewes and for lambs. And we tend to find decreasing levels of trace elements in certain types of soils, when we're actually applying different levels of lime to the pasture, certain type of species of grass, and certain reseeds. So they've got, it's not surprising that we find trace element deficiencies when we're on our pasture farms. What's important, I think, is actually identifying which ones are the ones to target. And it sounds very straightforward. It isn't, but at least having an appreciation of where we could actually look at the farm and where's the best spend of money, because trace element supplements, as we know, aren't cheap, so it's worth investigating. And just to give, I do not expect you to be able to interpret these, but it's just to give you an idea of the different interactions between all the different trace animal and elements that are occurring in the soil. So you've got the sphere on the right hand side there that's got all the different linkages with certain levels of certain trace elements and how they interact with other ones. And then on the left there, we've got just a simple representation of the available trace elements and how their availability increases or decreases depending upon the pH of the soil. So really, really complex, and it's no surprise that we don't get it right everywhere. But that gives us some sort of understanding as to what we're dealing with on farm. So the on-farm trace element audit, as I mentioned earlier, as we've done on probably some of your farms and what we're doing here. So we're looking at the supply of trace elements over a period of 12 months, and we look at what that farm is actually, what is available. So we're looking at water supply, We look at forage samples, and that's grazed grass and it's conserved forage. We look at supplementary feed, and we look at what licks and feed blocks and drenches and boluses are being supplied to that flock. And it's really important that we can do that, and so that we can get an appreciation of how many of where the deficiencies may be. And then we try and represent graphically the different levels of trace elements and requirements to the different levels of stock, because certain classes of stock require different levels. Growing lambs have got different requirements, for example, for cobalt compared to ewes. So again, we look at that and we try and represent that. And then we try and look at where the mismatch might be and where it's useful to add a supply if needed. So just as an example, and I'm not going to go into these because when we explain these to the individual farms, it takes a good hour to go through them. I just wanted to give you an idea of what we see, and this is what we found when we've looked at grass samples here on the farm, and these samples were from 2020, so they're very much it's a snapshot, and it's just provided some information for the way that we want to proceed this year, and it's given us a bit of a starting point, so useful. But for example, so with cobalt here, so if you look at both of the graphs, and it might not be easy for you to see, but the dark blue line, which is this navy line here, that is a requirement from that class of stock throughout the year. So we've got the months on the bottom, and then we've got the requirement of the minerals. And then the dotted orange line, which you can hopefully make out, that's the supply of that trace element from the pasture. And so we can look then at what the pasture is actually supplying and what the requirements are. And actually for cobalt, pretty marginal on the lambs, and actually the supply from the pasture would be okay there to the ewes, but appreciate that it's marginal to the lambs. And then the green line is the total supply, so that's incorporating what we're getting from the pasture and then what we're getting from any drenches, feed, or licks that are available. So you can see here that we get a spike in cobalt in March, around February, March, and that's when those ewes will receive a drench. And we also see a similar spike around the autumn. And then if you look at the lamb graph, you can see those spikes there, and we can pick out when they actually receive a bolus, and we've got the blue dotted line there, which represents when the bolus was given and the length of action of that bolus, and that you can see that that's raising levels. So quite useful, but also we've got this marginal line. It's also important, I suppose, to recognise that other factors will affect these trace element interactions. So for example, worm burden and so on. So we're mindful when we're looking at these graphs, what else is actually happening on the farm. We've got selenium there. I've just picked out cobalt, selenium and iodine. So we've got selenium there, which actually the pasture looks like it's supplying quite nicely for the lambs. We don't appear to have a deficiency in selenium. And then to the ewes, there is a potential deficiency there because we've got that higher requirement over that summer period. However, we've got a drench that goes in here for that's containing selenium, and there is a bit of hangover. Selenium will remain at elevated levels for a bit longer than the other trace elements, so we may not be too concerned about that because we get pretty much six weeks cover, but it's something to consider certainly. But again, like I said, this sets us up for this next year where to look. And then finally, we've got iodine. Now, iodine, we did actually, we have identified, I think, a significant deficiency here, both to the ewes and to the lambs. If you see the pasture there, which is that orange dotted line, is supplying very low levels of iodine. So we certainly may need to look at how we can lift requirements to this. Now, one of the drenches that was being used didn't actually contain iodine, so immediately we can make a change there, and we may we need to discuss really what is the best supply. So when we do these audits, we look at practically which classes of stock we're talking about, whether we feel that boluses would be useful, whether we feel that drenchers would be useful, and every farm and every class of stock is different. And so it really does require us needing to know what the deficiencies are and how they're going to be managed as to how we can best match that supply. So as Liz said, the plan for this year is to continue this. And so we've got a little bit of a baseline, but we're going to do some further analysis. We're going to get some grazing samples from this year for what the lambs are going to be grazing. And then we will look at adjusting the supply of trace elements, and particularly we'll make sure that we've got iodine in there. And then we're going to look at those growth rates, monitor them, monitor the response further, and get some, maybe use blood samples as well to look if they're actually receiving the required amounts from the supplements that we give. And then look at how we go on, and because we're trying to achieve efficient, profitable management, and actually these are the fine margins, these are the marginal gains that we need to improve that alongside everything else like parasite control. So this is a small but very important part of that, and it's something that we'll look at further and hopefully have something to talk to you about again at the end of next year.
Thank you, Philippa. I hope that gives you all an insight of what has been done so far and what we are hoping to do in the near future. So we've had one other question in for you, Rhys. So someone has asked, where do you source your rams from?
The million dollar question, is it? No, we're quite, say, as part of Ram Compare, we haven't had to purchase any rams over the last few years. And to answer that question is almost impossible because it depends which breed you're looking for. We've used top 1% Hampshire Downs from up Lincolnshire, top 1% Charlies from up Welshpool, top 1% Texels from Carnarvon and Carmarthen. So yeah, there's plenty of option out there, but what I would suggest is people go on the Signet website and look for the EBVs that you require. If not, the indexes of the whole stock, and iTexel is the one for the Texels. That's where I just start, and I look at the numbers first, and then we go and look at the sheep after. That's sort of what we have been doing and will be doing in the future.
Yeah, so you concentrate on the EBVs
first, and then look at the animal after. That's what we do. But
right, okay.
It might not be the biggest animal in the group, but it's figure driven we are now, and we are seeing massive gains in lamb growth and mothering ability and everything else from it.
Okay, and what breed of rams then do you usually go for?
We have gone for Hampshire. So we've got Hampshires here at the minute from Lincolnshire. We've got Texels from Carmarthen and Carnarvon at the minute. As I say, I look on iTexel next year to see what yearlings are about. If we need any more rams, we'll have to see what we're doing next, so we'll go from there.
Oh, great.
Right.
So we'll leave the questions there for now again, and we'll move on to James Rogeri from Hybiki Cymru, Meat Promotion Wales, who will give us a market and a project update. Over to you, James. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I'm not sure that the slides don't seem to be the correct slides. There we are. Grand. As I say, thank you very much for inviting me this evening. I've just got a quick 5 minutes just to take you through the lamb market at the moment, and just to quickly update you on some of the Hybiki Cymru projects on the go at the moment. So as you'll all know, it's been a really, really good year in terms of lamb price. Been really, really strong. Been unprecedented times, really, but we have to enjoy them while they're here. But interestingly, lamb price has sort of steadied a little bit over the last month or so. And we've actually, for the first time in quite a while, dropped below last year's price, round about by about £3.20, £3.50 a lamb, whereas cull ewes have been really, really strong and continue to be strong. And if we just look at the throughputs, this will explain a little bit of the lamb market. So very, very basically, it's all built around supply and demand. And over the last year, demand has been really good, and the supply of lambs coming onto the market has been down significantly, which has obviously really driven the price. As you can see, around about 10% less lambs killed over the last 12 months. And then again, if you look at, I was saying that it's sort of steadied a little bit after Christmas, and part of that will be down to, as you can see there has been a greater supply of lambs coming onto the market over the month of January. Some of that will have been done by high prices, but we also believe that there must have been a relatively large carryover of lambs. If you consider that was 10% less killed, then you'd imagine there's somewhere around that number extra being carried over. So we're hoping that the Easter demand will continue to help prices stay where they are or strengthen slightly. And again, we hope as we come out of COVID restrictions and things start to open up, that a lot of the food service market can reopen, which will hopefully add value into the lamb market. That was just very, very quickly through, just going through that. I will take any questions at the end. If anybody's got any questions directly about market prices. But I did quickly say that I would talk about our red meat development program. So we've got 3 projects on the go at the moment. That being Stock Plus, the Hill Ram scheme, and the Welsh lamb meat quality project. So I've gone too far, have I? So if we just start with Stock Plus. So Stock Plus is a project built around having active animal health plans. We're working with over 360 beef and sheep farmers across 42 vet practices in Wales. Some of the key health priorities identified have been in sheep flocks, worm control, as you might expect, lameness and fertility, and in beef herds, fertility again there, infectious disease and fluke. So we've got roughly about another 18 months of the project. And we're very much hoping that it will set a good precedent going forward for the kind of work that we'd like to be doing under the new payment regime. Sorry, I keep clicking the wrong button. Sorry. And then the Hill Ram scheme. It's a project all built around developing a critical mass of performance recorded hill sheep in Wales. Working with 54 ram producers with 7 breed types across Wales. Hopefully, Rhys has mentioned here today a lot about performance recording and the benefits from buying performance recorded rams. And some of the complaints have been that there isn't enough performance recorded hill type rams around. So this project is very much aimed at trying to get ram producers to performance record, so that we will have that critical mass available for flocks. And then lastly, we've got the Welsh lamb meat quality project. So we all know that we have a very, very good product here in Wales. However, the project is very much built about putting some science basically behind that. So as part of the project, we're looking at differences that may be caused by breed type, particular meat cuts, whether gender has a difference in terms of eating quality, and the lamb's diet, the aging of the meat, and we're also looking at seasonality. So we're working with a range of processors and farmers across Wales. This, consumer taste panels going on all over the UK to make sure that we're covering sort of a wide demographic, and we're hoping that the information that we've had so far has been really good. The feedback that we've had, people love the product, and we've got some very interesting results that hopefully we'll be able to disseminate in the next 12 months or so. So that was just a very quick whistle-stop tour through some of our ongoing projects. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that update, James. And finally now we're going to move on to Hannah Wright, who is a Local Development Officer, who's going to give us an overview of the available services the Farming Connect offer. So over to you, Hannah. Thank you.
Evening. As Linwyn has mentioned, I am the Local Development Officer for the Gower, South East Valleys and Vale of Glamorgan area. And I'm just going to quickly run through some of the services that are currently available through Farming Connect. So the application window for study visits is currently open. So you can apply for up to £3,000 towards a study trip for groups of farmers and foresters, which will cover 50% of the costs, and you can spend up to 4 days travelling and exploring different agricultural industries within the UK. The application window for this closes on the 31st of the 5th this year. The management exchange application window is also open at the moment. So this is £2,500 worth of funding available for you to visit either a farm or forestry business. It says within the UK, but it has now opened up to EU countries as well. And a full list of the countries that you're able to travel to is available on our website. And it's an opportunity for you to broaden your knowledge and learn new ways of working within your farming or forestry business. If you're not already aware, or if you haven't already been watching them, we have some small bite-sized videos on our FCTV Farming Connect YouTube channel, which you can access at any time. And also, we still have the mentoring service available. So this is up to 15 hours of free advice with specialist independent farmers and foresters who we class as being there and done it and got the information that may help answer any questions or queries that you have for future ideas within your business or current farming systems or forestry systems that you're already doing. A number of services have also been mentioned tonight by both Linwyn and Rhys throughout the evening. If you'd like any further information on these, the list of your development officers is available on our website with their full contact details of telephone numbers and email addresses. Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr, Hannah. Thank you very much, Hannah. There's a lot of services out there with Farming Connect, and I would really encourage you to contact your local development officer, as Hannah mentioned, and take advantage of these services. So we've had a few more questions in that we'd like to cover before we bring the meeting to a close. So first of all, a question for Rhys. Could you potentially put the infrastructure of slats and pumps in place, then erect a polytunnel over the system? Do you think that would work?
I don't see why not. The only slight issue would be the ventilation. Like people said, we should have open walls on our shed. We did put vent sheets on the side of our shed, but our shed is quite elevated and does catch a lot of wind. So if it weren't vented, there'd be a draft there. So it's good ventilation in our shed, but I suppose every system would be different, depends on ventilation and everything else. So I don't see why not, but bear it in mind, I suppose.
Yeah, that's great. And then we have a question for Liz. So how is it best to increase soil organic matter?
So in terms of, well, the key thing is, well, two bits. One is to keep adding organic materials. So that could be muck, or it could be farmyard manure, it could be compost. And that's trying to get it incorporated into the soil. And the other way is so that's trying to build up the amount of carbon going into, or organic matter going into the soil. The other way is also to try and stop losses, so that's by reducing cultivations. So that's why a lot of systems are moving towards either no-till or min-till systems. Basically, they're protecting, they're not causing further breakdown of what organic matter is there.
Great, thank you, Liz. We have a question then for Philippa. So Philippa, when should we consider trace elements as a limiting factor for ewe or lamb performance? What should we investigate first before undertaking a trace element audit?
That's a good question. I think that when they are, they're important for the whole cycle, I suppose, but certainly for fertility, we know that trace elements are important in use, and for growth rates and performing lambs, we know that trace elements are important. So when is best to investigate? Okay, so if we were to be looking at investigating the grazing platform, because that's what the lambs are going to, if we want them to be growing off grass and finishing off grass, and if we're not using any creep or any supplementary feed, because they will contain enough trace elements and they can kind of mask, I don't want to say mask, they can supply those trace elements if you're feeding hard feed to finish lambs. But if you're not and you're relying on grass and pasture alone, then really you need to sample that pasture to look at what it's going to supply, for that period. And you can also not just sampling the pasture, we want to look at what's in the animals as well. So we can blood sample lambs, we could blood sample weaned lambs, provided that they've not been on any hard feed or had any access to licks or had any drenches at least 6 weeks, ideally 2 months before, because that will impact on the blood levels. So the timing is critical to get an accurate result, and also it's quite specific, like I said, to that group of animals. So really it requires a conversation with your vet or your advisor to work out the best plan and the best timing so that you're getting the best from that spend of money on investigating.
Great, thank you, Philippa. And we've got another question for you as well. Why are the mineral requirements for lambs so variable during the year? Wouldn't you expect smooth rising requirements in line with growth and lamb weights?
Yes, you do, and that is what we see. So those graphs don't represent, they don't specifically represent that. If we broke them down a bit more detailed, I suppose, looking at and tracking them against age, we might be able to tease that out. But those graphs weren't really showing that. They were showing more growing lambs that are metabolizing more, that are working harder, that are putting down more lean meat and more cover and growing frame because they're growing, they're working harder, so they've got a greater demand for trace elements in that period, and also whilst they're developing a functioning immune system, they've got a greater demand for trace elements. So that is what we do see, and that is what we do expect to see. It's different for the different elements, which is what we know, and that's what we've worked out. So that's what when we represent it against the supply, or the requirements, should I say. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think that's brilliant. Thanks, Philippa. And then we've got a question for you, Rhys. So are you using nutrient and pH mapping on your grasslands? And if so, are you using variable rate application for lime, P and K?
We didn't use it for the carbon project, but it was one of the spin-off projects as part of being a demo farm to look into the digital mapping. I think it was Terra Maps was the system that we done our silage block of ground. That was very interesting. The only downside to our farm is we are quite we've only got a few flat fields on the farm then, so the variable spreaders are usually with big kit, and they'd make a hell of a lot more mess on the fields for the gain of the variable spreaders. We've got our own little Atkinson lime spreader, but we did look at the maps and sort of done a bit more lime in certain areas of the field where the pH was, didn't require as much lime and various bits and pieces. So although the mapping's good, I don't know if variable spreading suits our farm, but I think that Terra mapping is definitely going to be the future. But yeah, so that's as far as we've done.
Yep, thanks, Rhys. And just another question for you as well. If you can't lamb the ewes on slatted floors, when do you move them out to another shed to lamb?
So our main block are lambing March the 10th, so they come down the night of the 8th or the 9th. We put down sawdust and we put barley straw down, so we're using very little straw, or having the maximum use out of our straw, and it's lasting longer as when them ewes start lambing on the due date, they're coming out of them pens into little mothering pens. The ewes and twins are going into little pens, and then they're going out the fields and weather permitting and everything else. But so yeah, literally that day. If it weren't so much that we were trying to be as efficient as possible and get as many sheep on the slats and have the 3 feed passages just to maximise feed spaces, we'd probably put provisions to put little pens up that shed. But we were just working with the sheds we had, and we've maximised our housing options. And so yeah, and we've got this nice shed down here. It's not too shabby down here, so we're using the sheds. Both the sheds then?
Yeah, both sheds work well with you.
Yeah.
Oh, great, thanks, Rhys. And then we've got one last question then for Philippa. So Philippa, can sugar beet and fodder beet replace energy blocks?
So they have a good supply of energy, but they're actually low in protein. And energy blocks, okay, so if it's like for like, so if it's energy, then fodder beet and sugar beet is a great source of energy. So if it's energy that we're talking about, so if we're just talking about, say, molasses, etc., in a lick, then yes, they could be a good replacement, but you would really need to look at the balance of everything else in the diet and see what else they're actually getting. But if we are also requiring protein, we would need to look at that in a bit more detail, and they wouldn't replace that protein levels usually, because they are typically lower in protein. And U blocks that are used in licks close up to lambing tend to have protein in them. But it's important to look at which product we're talking about, because there is a whole range of products that contain different levels of energy and different levels of protein, and that are used as blocks or feed blocks, or that are used as licks. And so we would need to look at those specifically. But they are an excellent source of energy, and they're great for rumen function. Fodder beet.
Thank you, Philippa. So the last hour has flown by, and I'm aware that we've gone slightly over, but I hope you've all enjoyed this webinar here tonight. And I would like to try and bring it to a close now. So first of all, I would like to thank our speakers here tonight, Liz Jennifer, Philippa Page, James Rogeri and Hannah Wright. Thank you very much for your interesting presentations here tonight. I'd also like to thank you all that have taken the time to tune in this evening and to ask the questions and to watch, and to make it as interactive as possible. And last but definitely not least, I would like to thank Rhys, Russell and Eira for allowing us to host this webinar live from the farm here tonight and for speaking with us here tonight. I'm sure our viewers have all enjoyed. There will be an evaluation form at the end, and if you could fill it in, we'd be really grateful. And I think that's all I have to say. So I would like to bring this meeting to a close by saying once again, thank you very much for listening and good night. Nos da. Diolch yn fawr.